Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 30 of Life Lessons and Combat Sports. I'm your host, Eric Hamidi, and I guess from the very beginning, I should apologize for the delay in between episode 28 and 29. Wasn't exactly my plan to do so, but kind of like what I say in these other episodes is that I just feel like life kind of got in the way. So this past month was no exception. And, some unexpected things came up which caused that delay. So I apologize for that. It kind of impacted my delivery of episodes or the timelines and stuff like that. But I guess, that's life sometimes. What can you do? But regardless of that, I wanted to get in at least one more episode before the month of April was done, so then I could get one more edition of Aprilmania out there. And as y'all know, it's a month long full of wrestling themed episodes. So we're going to close it out with another one today. And it's kind of interesting in the sense that I feel like this particular episode I'm doing is kind of like a full circle sort of moment. I know that's a phrase that I use a lot in my episodes, but I feel like this is applicable because the subject matter for this episode is the same as my first episode. So the reason why I'm saying full circle is because of that, and we're coming back to a subject in a nice round number of an episode, that being episode 30. And the particular person that I'm going to be talking about is one Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, we're kind of venturing into another kind of territory here as far as talking about someone or something for a third time. But to be honest, there's a lot of different life lessons that you can take, not just with Steve Austin, but with a lot of different individuals or incidents or companies and stuff like that. So I knew I was gonna venture into this territory a little bit, or I knew I was gonna venture into this territory eventually. So here we are with that. I guess I picked a good time to do that. But regardless of that, we're gonna carry on with Aprilmania, and you've probably heard me say something like this in previous episodes, just the fact that, there's a whole bunch of podcasts that talk about the careers of certain individuals, and I'm going to do that briefly here, but it's not really what this podcast is about. It's just like there are other places you can go to in order to get that, and also this is a way for me to try to be different, but I will provide a little bit of a brief overview for, I guess, one of the most famous wrestlers ever. I mean, this was a guy who was such a huge mainstream star back in the day. So, I mean, the common person is going to know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is. But regardless of that, this just came to me. This is a little different than this is a little different from like my first episode, because I don't think I've really done a career breakdown of Steve Austin yet in my episodes, at least not to like such a great degree, because you have to consider when I was first doing these episodes, or like when I talked about Steve Austin, this was like right when I started the podcast. So it's kind of like I was still working out the podcast out, figuring out what my style or approach was. So it's kind of like I didn't really do that all that much, I believe. And one more thing that I will add, even though this is the third time that I am coming back to Steve Austin as far as a subject matter for this episode, it's kind of like, it's been a year since I've done an episode on him, so I figure enough time has passed for me to return to this subject. But anyway, without further ado, Steve Austin, he started wrestling in the late 80s. I would say the first significant thing that he did in his career was during his time in WCW, where he was part of the tag team, the Hollywood Blondes, won the WCW World Tag Team titles, and also won the US title at least once. I'm a little unfamiliar as far as how many times he actually won that belt, but he did win that belt. He did manage to do some notable things or achieve some stuff within that organization. In 1995, he ended up getting released from WCW, and he would go ahead and venture into, or just rather, he would go to ECW where he would spend a few months there, which is kind of funny how the last couple episodes I've been doing were kind of like ECW themed or adjacent. And it's kind of like, well, this subject matter, this particular episode is not necessarily about that, but here I go, I throw in a reference for ECW right there. And I guess you could say I also did that for WCW, considering that's what the last few episodes of my podcast have been about. But anyway, he spends a little bit of time there in WCW. Sorry, like we're going backwards here. He spent a little bit of time in ECW before making the transition to go to the WWF. And if you all remember from my episode last year that I did on Steve Austin, where I talked about him hosting the Tough Enough reality show, is that he basically starts in late 1995 under the ring name, the Ringmaster, which, as Steve Austin put it, that was his start in the industry, or that was like his foot in the door. So not exactly the best name, but hey, it was a start and it got him into the company, which, would end up being the holy grail, not the holy grail, but, would be where he would make his legacy. So he has the name Ringmaster for a little bit, but I mean, as Steve Austin put it, that wasn't really clicking for him. So he was trying to come up with a new name for himself. And basically the way that he came up with the Stone Cold Steve Austin name was that basically he brought up the idea to WWE creative to come up with this like cold-blooded character and just this badass and all that stuff. And it's a little funny because he got a list of names that were suggested by WWE, and we're going by all these, like, we're talking about all these different names that are, like, I'm talking about how he started as a ringmaster and then he transitioned into this character, and then some of the names that were suggested to him were Fang McFrost, Otto Von Ruthless, and Chili McFreeze. Jesus Christ. Just terrible names. I mean, apparently, as Steve Austin put it, he was just like, that's the best that you could come up with. So he's trying to figure out what his new name is going to be, and the way that he came up with the Stone Cold name was that his wife at the time gave him some tea, and he's like talking about how he's going to come up with a new name, and basically she was just saying, don't worry about it, you'll come up with something, just drink your tea before it gets stone cold. That name clicked, so he went with that and went on to have the career that he did, just being this massive star within the professional wrestling industry that really rivaled the kind of star power that like Hulk Hogan had in the 80s. From there, his star power just grew. I mean, like at first it was kind of like, okay, now he had a name to go off with, this like badass character, just this real like rugged person that like people can really hate and all that stuff, but then eventually became the anti-hero that everybody grew to love. I did mention in my first ever episode that Steve Austin did have a match with Owen Hart at SummerSlam 1997. It happened in August of that year, and they were wrestling for the Intercontinental Championship, and basically they did the spot where Owen was going to pile drive Austin onto the mat. It was more like a tombstone. It was like a sit-out tombstone pile driver, and Owen ended up driving his head to the mat for real, which was a serious injury. It was pretty devastating, and just, I'm not exactly sure if I said this in the episode explicitly, but when that moment happened, it was a real turning point in Steve's career, and it proved to be at the very, like, here's the thing. It was a turning point as far as how much it changed his style because of the limitations he had from that neck injury. But I think also what it may have done was just kind of shortened his career, really. Because, I mean, when you look at when that injury happened and then when he retired from wrestling full time, I mean, it was really over the span of like 6 years, really. I mean, I'm very curious about how much that really shortened the career for Steve Austin, because he really didn't. I mean, like, this is just an injury that he would have problems with basically for the rest of his career. But kind of like what I also alluded to in episode 1 is the fact that it's kind of like with Steve Austin, despite the short career that he had, or just like, you know, when you look at that time span from like 97 to 2003, that's like 6 years. So it's really not all that much in the grand scheme of things. However, you know, with Steve, it might have just been a situation where it was a matter of quality over quantity, because despite that short period of time, look at how much Steve Austin blew up and how he was just the face of wrestling, and definitely the face of the WWF from the late 90s going into the 2000s. And of course, he became the WWF champion there several times between that time span. And just, I think what happened was that as the 21st century rolled around, those injuries that Austin was dealing with were starting to plague him more and more, to the point where like he started wrestling less and less. So that kind of carried over into 1999, and when he was like taken off, he was written off TV for a little bit to deal with those injuries. Comes back in the fall of 2000, and you know he's managing to do stuff, but like you really kind of see I guess like in hindsight, you can see the end really coming once 2002 hits, because I remember there was a period of time where Steve Austin he was having like disagreements with creative with WWE at the time, and then that caused him to basically leave the organization in June of 2002. He'd be gone for several months and then came back in February of 2003. And it's a little interesting because I can't really say that he came back in 2003 to like resume his wrestling career, because he really didn't have that many matches after that. It builds up to a match between him and The Rock at WrestleMania 19 that year. It was on March 30th, 2003. And the fun fact about that match is that that would be Steve Austin's, I mean, at the time it was his last match ever, but, you know, now we know that would be his last match in 19 years. But like the thing was is that nobody knew about that going into it. From my research, the only people that really knew that that was going to be Steve's last match was Vince McMahon, the owner of WWE, Jim Ross, who was the commentator and head of talent relations at the time, and The Rock. Now, it's been a little bit since I've actually seen the match, so I do need to rewatch it, but from what I can tell, or just like what I'm predicting, or like based on my memory from like, you know, the past when I would watch that match, is that it is at the very least a very noteworthy match, and I'm sure those two like really delivered. As far as like what rating I would give the match or whatever, I don't know exactly, because it has been a long time since I've seen it, but I have no doubt that it delivers in some way, and it delivers, and it's satisfactory in many ways, basically, is what I'm getting at. So Rock beats him, and then that's it as far as his wrestling career, in-ring career goes. So like the thing that was kind of interesting, and I've kind of already alluded to this, is the fact that there was no announcement that, oh, this is Steve's last match and everything. So like for me, when they're like doing this storyline where he's like, you know, fired, and then he comes back as like an authority figure, it's like someone who's running the show for Monday Night Raw, which was WWE's, well, it still is, it's their Monday Night Wrestling show. At first, like as a kid watching it, I thought eventually he would do another match, but that just never ended up happening. he was just kind of like in this role for a year as far as being an authority figure. And then once the spring of 2004 hits, he stops making like regular appearances for WWE and then just goes into like making cameo appearances here and there throughout the next several years. So it's just kind of interesting seeing like how it was playing out, waiting for this eventual payoff that never ended up happening, and then in hindsight seeing like what it actually was. And that was, that was pretty much Steve Austin's career in WWE. I mean, he did have a match at WrestleMania 38 in 2022, but to be perfectly honest, I've never seen that match, so I can't really comment on it. But that leads into the life lesson for this episode, and where it comes from is basically this documentary that WWE did for WrestleMania 19 that came out around the time of WrestleMania 20. There's a piece of audio that Steve Austin says in that documentary that, I'll be breaking down one life lesson from that one line, but to be honest, I feel like there's a lot of different lessons you can get from that one quote that I'll probably come back to in later episodes. It's just, for now, I'm just going to focus on this one aspect of it, or just like this one interpretation of it. And basically what Steve Austin says is something along the lines of, because he knows this is his last match, and just, as a little bit of a side note right here, it's kind of interesting or just amazing and in some ways very like frightening how many people for WrestleMania 19 were dealing with like a lot of health issues that, really put into question whether they would actually be able to perform at that show. I mean, there was Steve Austin because he had like a health scare the night before. There was Kurt Angle dealing with his health issues. There's the shooting star press that Brock Lesnar did in his match with Kurt Angle that really hurt him and all that stuff. And just, I don't know, there's just a lot of scares right there. The line that Steve says is that when he's talking about his career coming to an end and everything, he's saying something along the lines of, it's wrestling, it's entertainment, and the machine has to keep working. And I understand how the system works, so that's why I don't want any sympathy. Basically, Steve says that he's an old gear that got used up, so you take that old gear out, you toss it aside in a pile of where all these other old gears are, you put in a new gear, and then the machine keeps rolling. That is what I'm going, that's like the theme that I'm going with here as far as understanding the system, which I suppose the way you can put it is like knowing what you're getting yourself into. I mean, there's many different interpretations you can have like about this, but understanding the system, knowing what you're getting yourself into, that is something that is very necessary in life. Just so then, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of like look at it. I mean, I look at it in one sense of like, okay, with regards to Steve Austin, him saying that, it's kind of like, hey, the show needs to, keep going, and just like, this is how I'm perceived when you're like an older star within the wrestling industry, and it's like, that's just the way that it is. And I think what's interesting about Steve saying that is that I kind of feel like in a weird way that's like a way for him to deal with the hardship of it. The hardship of like it all coming to an end, I guess. I guess here's a better way that I can put it. For one thing, if you know what you're getting yourself into, then you can make informed choices. You can make good choices, and it's like, hey, if you know all the things that go with a certain decision, then you can make an informed decision. That's one thing about it. But here's like a big thing that I've been thinking about lately. I think if you understand what you're getting yourself into, then that really helps negate some of the negative emotions that come with, maybe some of the cons of the things that you're doing. I mean, let's look at it, anyone who may be watching this. I mean, I'm sure we've all been in a situation where there was something that was gonna, there was some type of difficult decision that we needed to make. And it's like, what some of the drawbacks of said decision are, but you're at least aware of that. So then you can be more, I guess, more sure of yourself to go ahead with said action. If you understand what you're, doing, then that way you won't be upset about it later on, or just like you're accepting whatever kind of like consequences that come with it. And I just, I kind of talk about this in my Ali Revival Act episode, which has been in the news a lot in the combat sports space, to be perfectly honest, is, that whole idea of just like truly understanding your situation and what you're about to do. I think like, at the very least, if nothing else, if you know all the implications or like the ramifications of the thing that you're going to do, then that avoids the problem later on, where if it doesn't turn out well for you, you can't be all like, oh, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. So that's one aspect of it. But to be perfectly honest, I'm kind of thinking about it a little bit like bigger scale, as far as I think that could, like, as long as you understand what you're getting yourself into, then it can help cope with any of the like negative emotions that may come with said decision. Here's a way that's kind of played out for me, is that coming back to the whole career stuff, which is like something that I feel like I do a lot of, there was a conversation that I was having with a friend of mine just a long time ago, talking about like the production industry, or just like the film production space and all that stuff. And I remember that person telling me that, you kind of, well, at least you knew that it was going to be difficult and all that stuff. And just, I remember at the time it was a little difficult for me to come to terms with that, or just like really, there was some type of a rebuttal that I had, as far as there were certain aspects about the production industry that I didn't know was going to be like as difficult as it was. And some of those things relate to like, the intricacies of how difficult it is to move up in the field, or just like, being able to land paid gigs and stuff like that. Like, there may have been like some idea that I may have had, but I didn't truly understand like the full grasp of how difficult that was going to be. Now, if that was something that, I was a little more informed about, then different decisions could have been made, or just like, I guess you could say like things would have played out differently, or it could have done stuff better. But I mean, it's impossible for me to say, or to like, it's impossible for me to say like, oh, this is how things would have been different, because it's all just like speculative. And, to be fair, there is some type of personal accountability, or like, responsibility I need to have, as far as like, whatever kind of like struggles I've had, or just like how things have kind of like played out. So, I don't want to just put all the blame on that, because like ultimately it does fall back on me. But I think like really having that kind of like thorough understanding, maybe that was a little lacking at the time. And hopefully, if you're watching this, then you can basically avoid those kind of like pitfalls. And just speaking of avoiding, this was another thing that I was thinking about, like leading up to this episode, was just the idea that if you know what you're getting yourself into and you understand the system, or just like, you know the type of field you're going into, or just like what your decision, like what may happen from a decision that you make, it may help you even avoid a bad situation entirely. I mean, I guess it can play out in like people's professions, just like, oh, if you know that these are the drawbacks of a certain career, and you know that you don't want to deal with it, then you don't start working in that field. So I guess like that's one way to put it, but I mean, like, there's a million different interpretations about that. I suppose one thing that I do want to point out is that, like, with the whole idea of Steve Austin basically saying like, oh, hey, I understand how the system works and that's why I don't want any sympathy or whatever. I mean, this is stuff that I can only really confirm if I were to ever speak with Steve, but like my takeaway from that is like, I suppose when he was saying that, like that may be like, when he's talking about how like broken down his body is, he doesn't want sympathy from like people he's talking to, or from like, the public, like, oh, the feeling sorry for him. But I wonder if there is an aspect of that where, when he's saying he doesn't want any sympathy, if it's like because there's a certain degree, I mean, and I want to make something very clear. This is all speculative because like I have no idea about this. But I wonder if that's in some relation to how the company is just going to keep trucking along, even though you have Steve Austin, who's like, basically this is the end of the road for him. I mean, like, I have no, like, I guess it kind of like, plays out where, once again, coming back to the whole job thing. I mean, like, it could play out in the sense of like, hey, somebody works for a company for a very long time and then out of the blue they end up getting fired. It's kind of like one of those things where it's like, yeah, the person worked with the company for a long time, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's a business, and it's just like, you can be let go at any point, due to like, because the company isn't making as much money, or like whatever it may be. I mean, it's a business, so you can't expect too much like emotion behind it. So when Steve is saying that, I wonder how much of that is playing a factor in him making that kind of a statement of like, oh, well, I don't want a lot of, like, I don't want sympathy, or just like, I don't expect the company to like, make this big consideration about like my career, or giving me like this, very emotional farewell or something like that. I wonder if like that's something that he's referring to, or like that he's talking about when he says that thing. And I should add to that I'm also saying this because like, I don't know to what degree that there was this lack of consideration from WWE when Steve Austin's career like ended, or when he had to retire, in the sense of like, oh, well, did they, give him a good enough of a farewell, or just like, did they like provide a lot of emotional support? Like, I don't know to like what extent that may have been a factor or anything like that. It may not be a factor at all. I mean, honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, that might be a good question to ask, as far as like, oh, with regards to that, is that to avoid any kind of like, misconceptions about how WWE would respond? Like, I don't know, like, I guess maybe there was like this idea of like, or I wonder if there's just this idea of like, hey, don't expect WWE to linger on this too much, because it's like, we gotta keep going with like the shows that we have. That'd be an interesting thing to try to like talk to him about. And just like, I will say this. If that aspect of how the company is responding to Steve Austin's retirement is a consideration in this factor, I wonder if Steve Austin saying to himself and saying to anybody who would listen, hey, I understand how this system works and I don't want sympathy, that's a way for him to not be upset with perhaps how quickly along WWE moved after his retirement. it's funny how like the more I'm kind of like talking about this, the more I'm kind of like raising questions for myself as far as like what I'm thinking or just like how this whole advice piece can play out. I find that fascinating, but like, you know, at least in Steve Austin's case, it helps regulate emotions, which I think is another, key factor or an important facet of life is to like, make sure that you know what you're doing and know what you're getting yourself into. So then that way it helps you regulate your emotions. Those were some of my thoughts that I wanted to share about this subject matter. I mean, there's probably some more things that I could say about all this, but thankfully, as I've already kind of prefaced, there's a lot of different life lessons I can take from that one line. So, worst case scenario, if I ever forget, or it's like if I did forget something, I can just bring it up at a later time. But that to me, I feel is a good way to conclude Aprilmania. And even though it's played out a little differently than I would have liked, I'm still happy that I got a chance to do this. I'm happy that I got one more episode out before the month of April was done. But let me know what you guys think about this episode, or if you have any favorite matches or memories of Stone Cold Steve Austin, put them down in the comments section below. Be sure to like, share, subscribe to my videos. Be sure to follow me on my social media accounts, Life and Combat Sports on Instagram and L Combat Sports on Twitter. And yeah, that brings an end to Aprilmania, which I'll end by saying this. For the second year in a row, it seems as though once March hit, I was doing a lot of wrestling themed episodes, or just like really kind of like focusing on that and just like putting out a lot of content related to that, and just like all my episodes like basically from March to now have been something about the realm of wrestling. And kind of like what I said last year, you would think this is a pro wrestling podcast, but it's not. It's a combat sports podcast. For the second year in a row, I feel like I've been kind of ignoring the sport of mixed martial arts. It's funny how things kind of play out. I wonder if this is going to happen next year as well. But we're going to make up for that, because as April comes to a close, we got the month of May coming up, which means I got to do my month long of mixed martial arts themed episodes. So we're going to go right into MMA. I'm excited for that. I'm looking forward to it. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.